Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here for this video on communication. In this video, we're going to be covering chapter 11 of Robbins and Judge's Organizational Behavior, 18th edition, which focuses on communication in the workplace and its impact on organizational behavior. So, does communication really matter in organizational behavior? Now, that's a really interesting question because I actually know a lot of people who, when they teach courses on organizational behavior, don't cover communication at all. But I would argue that communication might be one of the most important factors in organizational behavior. Why would it be one of the most important factors? Well, if you recall earlier in our course, we talked about perceptions and how important perceptions are in the workplace because people respond to perceptions rather than responding to reality. Well, our perceptions are all based upon our experiences with communication. Communication is how we get the information that we build our perceptions on. So because of that, communication is critical to just about everything that we learn about in organizational behavior. Communication serves five very important functions within a group or an organization. Okay, and these functions are management, feedback, emotional sharing, persuasion, and information exchange. All right, now, on the next few slides, we're going to break each one of these functions down in a little more detail. The first function that communication serves is to manage member behavior within the organization. All right, so there are a lot of different types of formal communication that manage behavior. So we have our hierarchies, we have guidelines, job descriptions, company policies. We might have memos that come out giving our employees a directive. Okay, we might have daily meetings where managers tell employees what it is that they want them to do. All these can be different types of formal behavior that communicates in such a way that we help to manage people's behavior. Okay. There's also work group teasing or harassing. And what does that look like in the workplace? Well, I remember years ago when I started my first office job, I walked in a long sleeve button down shirt and a tie, and I was the only person wearing a tie in the office. Okay. And all of a sudden, this guy who sat across from me, his name was Scott, he looked at me and he called me necktie. And before I knew it, everybody in the office called me necktie for the rest of the day. Well, it was pretty clear to me at the end of that day that wearing a necktie to work was not what I was going to do there. And part of what had happened there was my coworkers had communicated that by teasing me, in a way that they wanted to manage my behavior so I didn't do it in the future. Because if I had worn a necktie to work every day, then maybe all of a sudden somebody else would have picked up on that and it would have become an expectation. So to prevent that from happening, there was a process of communication that my coworkers went through to manage my behavior. The next function of communication is feedback. Okay. And with feedback, we're simply just clarifying what employees have to do, how they're doing it, how they can improve their performance. So, one place where we'll get feedback is on our performance reviews, right? When managers will sit down and give us information and perceptions in terms of how we've been performing, what it is that we need to do to improve. But we often get feedback on a daily basis. So sometimes you close a deal and your boss comes up to you and says, "Hey, nice job with that sale," and gives you a high five or a pat on the back. Okay, that's an example of feedback. All right. One time I had an employee who had a little bit of an outburst in the office. I had to pull them aside and talk to them about why their outburst wasn't appropriate and what they should do in the future if they were feeling stressed. That's another example of feedback. But feedback occurs in our communication throughout the day in organizations. Another function of communication is emotional sharing. All right. And emotional sharing is just basically how people show their attitudes in a genuine way within the organization. Sometimes their sharing has to deal with attitudes that are formed based upon things in the organization. Sometimes their sharing has to do with things completely outside of the organization. Okay. So often, I had people in the workplace who would talk to me about things that were going on outside of work that were completely not relevant to work whatsoever. So they may tell me about something that was going on with a kid or another family member. And it was really more of a way of venting or feeling better about the situation or making sure that I understood the context of some of their behaviors. Sometimes people will share things that are related to their life outside of work, but also connected to the workplace. So I remember there was a time in my career where I was given a directive to take all of my employees off of set schedules. And when I went to talk to one of my employees who was on a set schedule, we had a very extensive venting session where he explained some financial situations and some things that he was dealing with and why it was important to him to have a set schedule because he was working two jobs. And that was an emotional sharing of feelings right there, but it also, was a communication that helped me to understand his situation and influence my decision making as well. So it served the purpose of emotional sharing, but it also served a few of the other purposes that we're going to talk about in a minute. Next, we're going to talk about persuasion. All right, and persuasion can be good or bad. All right, sometimes people are persuaded to do positive things, sometimes they're persuaded to do negative things. Okay, but generally speaking, what we're trying to do is influence behavior with persuasion or get people to buy into to different ideas. All right, so as a manager, persuasion was critical to what I did because I could tell my employees to do something, but if I could convince them that it was important, I was much more likely that they were going to be successful in their efforts to do the work that I'd asked them to do. And the final function here that we're going to talk about is information exchange. All right, so information exchange really just is about us gathering information that we might not have through other channels. Sometimes you send an email and ask somebody for some more information, and they'll provide a response that helps you make a decision. In the case that I talked about earlier with the employee on the set schedule, okay, even though there was a lot of emotional sharing that went on in that session, I also gained a lot of information that influenced the decisions that I had to make in that process. Okay. So information exchange is critical to our decision making because it allows us to be closer to the rational model that we talked about before. It allows us to make decisions that are based on more complete information than we can when we don't exchange information. Now, I want you to think about the communication process. And the communication process starts with the person who is going to be sharing information. That person is the sender. Okay, and that person might have information that they want to share. So, for example, I had to cancel a class because of a vaccination. Okay, that information there is the message that needed to be sent. All right. Next, I have to encode that message, which basically means I have to translate that into something that I can send out to the people who need to receive the message. All right. So, I may do this in one of many ways. In the example that I'm thinking of, I started with an email. Okay. So I typed the information out in an email. All right. And the choice to use the email was that email is the channel that I use to communicate the information. All right. Then the email goes out to my students. My students are the receivers. Okay. So they receive the email. All right, and the email sitting in their inbox, the message has been received. And then finally they have to read the email and make sense of it. And that process there is the message decoding. Now, all throughout this process as we go through, it's highly possible that something could be miscommunicated or people could misinformation. And that's because we have noise in the communication process. All right. And this noise, there's things that get in the way of communication. So some students have me on auto delete, so that keeps them from even receiving the message. So that's some noise that gets in the way there. Okay, perhaps I use a word in the email that students didn't understand. That might be noise that gets in the way. All right, there's a variety of different types of message interference that constitute noise that we could see. All right, and then the feedback comes in here after the students decode the message. The feedback is how they explain what message they receive from me. Okay, so me verifying that they know the class was canceled, me verifying that they know that maybe a due date was moved or something to that effect. All right, that is an example of feedback. Now, once we've looked at the communication process, it's important to understand the direction that information flows. And when information flows from the top of the organization, like a CEO or president, down through managers, and then all the way continuing down to employees, that's what we call downward communication. Okay. Now, downward communication is often typically one way. All right. So, as the information is communicated from one level of the hierarchy to the next level of the hierarchy, there is no feedback that comes back up. Okay. So, things do not change based upon that feedback. All right, it's strictly information going from the top down, and that can be a little bit problematic because sometimes that makes people at the lower levels of the organizations feel like they might not be heard. It also can create a scenario where people at the lower levels of the organization might have valuable information that could have shaped a decision, but that their information is not considered in that decision. Communication can also go in the opposite direction where it goes from employees up to leadership, and that's what we call upward communication. Okay, now upward communication can be very valuable in our organizations. Sometimes some of our best ideas come from our employees because they understand our business in a way that is different from how leaders understand the business. So employees can provide very valuable feedback through upward communication. Okay, but there are some challenges with upward communication. Okay, one of the challenges is that managers have so much information coming at them that it can be very difficult to get through all the feedback that you get from employees. So as an employee, if you're communicating upward, you want to be sure that you communicate simple messages that get people's attention. Okay? Sending a very short email with a catchy reference line on it and a short and to the point body on that email is going to be much more effective than sending out a 5-page email that somebody needs to go through in detail in order to understand your point. Okay, it's also important for employees' well-being that and for their positive continuation of employment that they communicate things in a positive way. Okay, so you may have negative feedback, something that a manager might not want to hear, and you could be honest about that, and you should be honest about it. But you must also frame it in a positive way, such as rather than this is a terrible idea and I can't believe the company is doing this, you might want to put something out there like I like that the company is trying to address this issue. One of the challenges that I see is X, and I think that if we did Y, it would help address that issue a little more effectively. Okay, you could see how one is going to be received a lot better than the other. All right, and that's very important in upward communication. Lateral communication occurs when people at same level or similar hierarchical levels within the organization communicate with each other. All right, and this can also often be something that helps save time. So, for example, if we have a manager up here, and then we have a subordinate here and a subordinate here, if subordinate, let's call this person here subordinate A, and we'll call this person here subordinate B. If subordinate A has to go up to management only to have management go down to subordinate B, okay, that's a lot slower than if subordinate A can just talk to subordinate B. So we can kind of speed up our communication sometimes with lateral communication. All right. This is very good if management supports it. Okay. Where this can become a challenge is that sometimes we have lateral communication. So we might have communication between these two people over here, and management might not be aware of it. And we might end up having changes that take place without management being aware. And that's when we can have some challenges with lateral communication. Okay. It's also very important that we don't find ourselves getting into dysfunctional conflict as a result of lateral communication. Sometimes managers want us to follow the chain of command and communication because there are concerns that when people communicate laterally and they don't have someone who can kind of manage their different goals in terms of how we make decisions, that communication can become dysfunctional. Now, it's important as we look at common types of small group networks that we remember that communication gets more complicated the larger our organization or our group gets. Okay, so these are some pretty small and simple models that we're looking at here. but we're going to go over each one of them here real quickly. The first one being the chain. Okay, and the chain basically is a situation where one person can communicate with another, but then that person goes to the next person in the chain, and so on and so forth. Okay, and it's put here in the shape of a pentagon. Okay, so it creates the image that there is a small group here. But you could also have something like this in terms of a hierarchy. So this could be the first level of the organization. This could be the second level of the organization here. And this could be the top level of the organization. So something like line level employees have to communicate with managers. Managers communicate with their boss, and their boss communicates with other managers who communicates with their line level employees, and so on. All right, then we have the wheel, and in the wheel we have one person who is the center point of communication. Okay, and that person basically is kind of the center of the node, and everybody goes to that person, and then that person distributes information throughout the group from there. Okay, and this could be like a centralized position in a corporation as well. So you might have a situation where if you had an employee transferring, you had to call HR. You didn't call the location that they were transferring to, and then HR called the location that they were transferring to. Okay, so that would be kind of an example of the wheel. And then we have all channel communications where basically anybody can communicate with anyone. All right, and organizations are trending towards this idea of open communication, and they like to celebrate the fact that they have open communication. But one thing that we do need to remember is that sometimes there are some challenges that can be created by open communication. All right, the all channel wheel can create challenges because sometimes there's a lack of coordination in the communication that takes place as a result of not having any structure in terms of communication. Now, as we compare the different type of networks that we just looked at, we can see that the speed of communication is fastest in the network wheels and in the all channel model. All right, we can see that the accuracy of communication tends to be highest in the chain model and the network wheels. All right, we can see from this chart that leaders are most likely to emerge in small groups when we use the network wheel. Okay, and member satisfaction tends to be highest though in the all channel. All right, so this chart here can be kind of helpful in terms of being able to look at communication models and see where the benefits and weaknesses of each type of model are. So you can decide what type of network you want to build in your organization. Now, we've talked a lot about formal communication chains within the organization, but there are also informal chains of communication. All right, I've got an image over here of Marvin Gaye with his hit song, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which was all about Marvin Gaye singing about hearing that his girlfriend was going to break up with him, but not hearing it from her, hearing it through other people that were talking. And those other people that were talking is what he's referring to as the grapevine. And we have the same type of things in our organizations. Now, obviously, they're discussing different topics, although sometimes there is some gossip being discussed in the grapevine in organizations. But often, these topics have to do with we might hear through the grapevine that somebody's upset about a change in the workplace, or we might hear that somebody is thinking about leaving the organization. We hear all sorts of information like this. And by being tuned into the grapevine, managers have a little more understanding as to what's happening in their organization so that they can respond to the needs of their people. They also can start to identify people who might be a little more loyal, as those people will be the people who are kind of cluing them in to what's being said on the grapevine. And speaking of the grapevine, this table here deals a little bit with how, as leaders, we can deal with gossip and rumors in the workplace. Okay, and I'm going to kind of sum up this table here by drawing on something that one of my former deans actually used to say. I had a dean who used to go into meetings and he would say, "I'm going to share the information with you that I have. I'm going to share everything that I can have, because I understand that when there are gaps in information, people are going to fill those voids by making up their own truths." Okay. And he said, rather than having you make up your own truth, I'd rather you have as much of the truth as you can have. Okay, and that's kind of the theme behind this table here. Okay, so box one talks about sharing the information you have and letting people know what information you don't have so that they trust the communication coming from leadership and aren't necessarily seeking to fill that void because they expect that the void will be filled as soon as you have the information that allows you to fill that information void for them. Okay, explain. So as a manager, discuss what decisions are being made and why they're made, as well as what your plan is going forward. Don't let people guess as to why you made different decisions. If you can explain the logic behind your decisions, people are less likely to come up with stories to explain them. Okay, respond to rumors non-committally and then verify the truths that you can. And the point to this is you're hearing things on the grapevine, now you have to address them. Okay? And then invite employees to discuss their concerns, their ideas, their suggestions, and so on. And really, what this does is if employees feel that they can go to management with their concerns, they're going to be less likely to vent about their concerns to other employees through informal channels. All right. And then when you hear these concerns, you can help the employees frame their thoughts into more objective viewpoints. So you can kind of take things that might seem a little bit out there or a little bit biased or a little bit overly concerned in terms of how employees are looking at information and help them start to pull the facts out of that and frame things more objectively. So now that we've talked a little bit about communication structure, let's talk about how we communicate. Okay, and the primary way that we tend to communicate with people is through oral communication, and there's a variety of different types of oral communication. So we can have meetings, video conferences, telephone, informal rumor mills, one-on-one discussions, speeches. All these things fall under the umbrella of oral communication. Okay, and oral communication, generally speaking, can be fairly rich in context. But one of the major challenges that we deal with oral communication is that it can be distorted. So as a message goes from one person to the next person to the next person and so on, the message changes just slightly, or important details can get left out. Okay, a few of the most common ways that we communicate orally in the workplace are meetings, video conferencing, and telephone. All right, with meetings are incredibly common. In the United States, over 11 million meetings typically happen in any given day. Okay. And as much as we use meetings a lot, there can be a lot of controversy over meetings because they do impede people's schedules. Sometimes they're not always viewed as being productive. One of the most common phrases that you'll hear in industry about meetings is this meeting could have been an email. Okay. So you want to make sure that as you're scheduling meetings and planning meetings, you're thinking about how do you make valuable use of your employees' times. Okay, now meetings we generally think of as being in person, but they also can have a video conferencing component. So, maybe being on a tool like WebEx or Zoom. Okay, but one thing that's interesting is not everybody likes to be video conference. So a lot of people in these meetings will actually have their video turned off for a variety of reasons. One reason may be they prefer not to be on camera. Another reason could be that perhaps their internet bandwidth or their computer just can't support the data transfer of video conferencing. All right. And then we also have the telephone, which is essentially like video conferencing without video. Telephone obviously can be a landline or a cell phone, and it's really one of the fastest ways that we can communicate because we can easily pull out a phone and dial somebody's number and get a hold of them if they answer. As we engage in oral communication, it's very important that we think about how we say things. Okay, so think about the emphasis that we put on different words in a sentence. And this chart kind of walks us through that. So I'm going to say a few different sentences for you, and I want you to think about the meaning that you're going to see over in the right hand column. So we're going to ask all about why don't I take you to dinner tonight, but we're going to ask it different ways. So here's the first line: why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Okay, now you notice the emphasis on you there kind of gives a little bit of some insight that maybe I was going to take somebody else. Okay. Then the next line: why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Okay. So the emphasis on I there basically means that maybe you were going to go with somebody else. All right. The next line: why don't I take you to dinner tonight. All right. The emphasis on don't indicates that we're trying to find a reason that I shouldn't take you. All right. Let's move on to the fourth line. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? So the emphasis on why there indicates that maybe there's some type of problem there. All right. If we go to the next line, we have why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Okay. The emphasis on take could mean instead of going on your own. It also could indicate that maybe you weren't planning on going to dinner. Maybe you were going to call dinner in or cook in. Um, the next line, why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Okay, the emphasis on dinner indicates that we're talking about dinner instead of lunch. All right, and then why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Okay, the emphasis on tonight there indicates that maybe we're thinking about tonight instead of a different day. All right, so what you notice there is all those sentences were exactly the same in terms of the words that were used, but there were 7 or 8 different ways that we said this sentence, and each way that we said it gave it a different meaning. So when we're engaging in oral communication, we have to be very aware of how we say things so that we communicate the message as it's intended. In addition to oral communication, we also engage in written communication in the workplace. Again, our written communication is particularly important because it documents what we've said. Okay, once something's out there in writing, it's a little easier to retrieve than things that were said orally. So there's a variety of different types of written communication that we use. Okay, one is letters, and although letters are a little bit of an older style of communication. They are still used today, and quite candidly, a handwritten letter is something that people tend to remember. Okay, so there is a point where letters are very helpful. Okay, to that point, probably not for something that's too urgent. Probably something more where we're looking to make an impression, right? Then we have presentation slides like PowerPoint and Prezi and things of that nature, and these are used in conjunction with our oral communication. So in a meeting, in addition to speaking, we'll have slides just like the ones you're looking at here. Okay, if we want to have good slides, we want to try to make sure that we break up the text, have some images in them, okay, and then keep things short and to the point. All right, email, instant messaging, and text messaging are all very similar technologies, okay, but how we view them can be a little bit different. All right, so email is a little more formal than the other two. When you write an email, you want to make sure that you use a good reference line that gets people's attention, or if they don't know you, that is going to draw them into reading your email. You want to make sure that you're pretty short and to the point with your email, okay? Because if your email is too long, people obviously aren't going to get into the depths of it, but you also want to make sure that you're professional. All right, instant messaging and text messaging are becoming more and more difficult to differentiate these days because a lot of the instant messaging that we do is on our phones. Okay, these can be a little less formal in nature, but generally speaking, the advice I'd give you on using these types of tools is let the person who has the higher status in the interaction set the tone for formality. Okay, so I wouldn't be the first person to type K in a text message until I saw that that was kind of the norm that was set by somebody who had a little more status in the interaction. All right. We also have social media that we use for written communication. And social media can be things like it can be LinkedIn, it could be Twitter, it could be Facebook, it could be Instagram. All these things count as different types of written communication. They're places where, we one might reach out through their messaging functions, but two, we're also communicating information consistently there. Okay. So viewpoints get shared, messages that we want the public to hear get posted. All right. Apps. Apps are very difficult to differentiate from a lot of the things that we talked about here because a lot of our text messaging and our emails and our instant messaging will come through apps. So you might think about something like WhatsApp, okay, or WeChat. But truthfully, those kind of fall into an application that we might have on our phone, but also fall into another category such as instant messaging. Okay. And then finally we have blogs or weblogs, and these are basically like websites where people can update information, post articles, post their thoughts, and communicate various other types of information. When we communicate in writing, it's very important that we pay attention to our grammar, okay? Because our grammar can change the way people interpret sentences, they can change the meanings of sentences. So I've got an example for you here. I want you to take a look at this sentence. It says, we managed to withdraw our employment offer before the candidate accepted and began investigating other options. So, what does this sentence mean? All right, if we take a look at this, what this sentence means, it means that the offer was withdrawn before the candidate accepted and before the candidate began investigating other options. So we managed to withdraw our employment offer before the candidate accepted and began investigating other options. All right. So these are the two things that we withdrew the offer before the candidate did. Now, in the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the same sentence with a slight grammatical change and see how it changes the meaning of the sentence. All right, now all we've done here in this sentence is we've added a comma. All right, and we're going to read it again. We managed to withdraw our employment offer before the candidate accepted and began investigating other options. Now, here, just that one little comma changed the entire meaning of the sentence. It means that the offer was withdrawn before the candidate accepted. Now, this part here is the same, but it then means that we began investigating other options. Okay, so instead of it being before the candidate began investigating other options, after we withdrew the offer, we began investigating other options. And just that addition of the comma here changed the entire meaning of that sentence. All right, and this contrast here illustrates why it's so important to make sure that our emails, our letters, our other or our other written communication are formatted in such a way that they are grammatically correct. So, what are the consequences of sending an email that might not be grammatically correct and communicates slightly different information than you intended? You might be wondering. Well, here's the consequence. You've just communicated a completely different message, and whoever you're getting this message off to is going to now respond to a message that is different from what you meant to communicate to them. So, their response, their actions, their behavior in the workplace are going to essentially be incorrect because the information as they received it was not what you intended to send. Another place where you want to be really clear on written communication is if you have any types of standardized forms that you use in the workplace. So this is a great form here that I got, and this is from COVID-19 vaccinations. And you'll see for those of you who aren't familiar with the COVID-19 vaccination, there are several different vaccinations out there. Most of them require 2 doses. Okay, so this is for the Moderna vaccination, which required 2 doses. And what you see is at the very top of the form, it is very clear that this is for a second dose. Okay, so we see it printed up here, very clear for a second dose. And this is actually the form I got when I went in for my second dose. Okay, and then what they ask you to do is they ask you to go through a series of screening questions here. And they've pre-filled all the screening questions for you, which is nice. So you can see that they're all pre-filled right down this line. They all say no. And basically, what the patient has to do is the patient has to go through all these statements and make sure that no is the accurate statement. Well, when we get down to statement number 8, which is this row right here with the red arrows, okay, the statement reads, have you ever received a dose of the COVID-19 vaccination? Well, think about that for a second. If this is the second dose, obviously, if you're getting the second dose, that would mean that you probably should have received the first dose. Okay. So my interpretation of this would have been yes, I've received a dose. I received the first dose. But you'll notice that what they pre filled here was an N. They pre filled a no. So as I was going through the form before I signed it, I went over to one of the people who was working the station and I asked them about question 8. Before I even finished asking about question 8, they said, yes, we understand you received the first dose, but they're referring to a complete vaccination, knows the answer that they want there. And I said, boy, you knew that answer quickly. And they said, yeah, we've been getting that question quite a bit. Okay, so think about that. They've been getting that question quite a bit because it's clearly unclear. We're looking at a second dose form that's asking if you've ever received a dose, as you notice right here, a dose, and we want people to say no. Okay. So think about that. If every person who sees this, maybe not every person who sees this is confused. Okay. Maybe they have hundreds of people go through every day, but maybe out of those hundreds, maybe 100 people are confused about this every day. Okay. And those 100 people each spend 1 minute talking to an employee about this. Okay. So they each spend 1 minute. So that ends up being 100 minutes that the organization is paying for employees to explain this to people every day. Over the course of a week, 5 days in the week, that becomes 500 minutes. Okay. We take that 500, we divide that by 60, and that is equal to, that's actually greater than 8 hours throughout the week. So that means we're paying over a full shift throughout the week for someone to just answer questions that are created by the confusing nature of the language that was chosen to be used on this form. So when you build forms like this, you want to make sure that you go through and maybe test them a little bit with people who are the kind of people who are going to be filling out these forms. Okay, you don't want people who aren't going to be filling out the forms to be the ones to read them over and test them. You want to have actual potential form people who are going to be using the forms to respond to it, because they're going to help you understand what's not clear in your communication. Now, you may remember earlier in the course, we talked a little bit about how managers communicate and how much of their time they spend communicating. This graph here shows that the average manager and professional spends over half their time at work communicating. All right, the first factor we look at here, and this might be kind of shocking, is that managers and professionals spend over a quarter of their time reading and answering email. Okay, so this is one of the real costs of email, is that people are spending so much time being involved in their email. So it's very critical that you don't email people things that they don't need to receive, and also that we figure out how to filter what emails we need to look at and what emails we don't need to look at. Okay? Then they spend about another 20% of their time or 19% of their time searching and gathering information. All right. Then another 14% of their time communicating and collaborating internally. Then the rest of their time is dedicated to role specific tasks. Now, if we go back a few slides here, we talked about social networking sites or social media in terms of communicating. This is a really interesting graph here. This is a graph that shows survey results for a survey that was conducted by CareerBuilder, where they asked professionals if they use social networking sites to research job candidates. Now, you'll notice here that really more than half of the people they surveyed said no, but 11% said yes, which basically means that if you apply for a job, you have a 1 in 10 chance that somebody is going to have looked you up on Facebook or looked you up on LinkedIn or Twitter. Okay. But then the rest of the survey participants, 37% of them said no, but soon, meaning that they didn't have a system for doing this, but they were planning on doing it. And this is critical to understand as a job applicant, because one of the things that you want to recognize here is that you may use some social media for personal purposes, not for professional purposes, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to impact your career. Okay. Now, as managers, we do definitely want to be careful with using social media in terms of evaluating job candidates, because we want to make sure that we are one, just evaluating job relevant criteria. Okay. And two, we want to make sure that the information that we attain by searching people on social media doesn't bias our results in any ways that are systematic, that are potentially illegal or unfair to candidates. Nonverbal communication is also an important part of our oral communication. So when we meet with people, when we're in meetings or giving presentations or talking in person, a lot of times we're talking with our hands, or we're making expressions with our face. Maybe we're smiling, maybe we're frowning, maybe we have a serious face. Our eye contact can communicate information. All right. All these things tell us things. So if our arms are crossed while we're talking to somebody, that often signals that we're closed off. All right. If we're not making eye contact, that might signal disinterest. All right. For me, I tend to talk with my hands a lot when I'm excited about something. So if you see I'm talking and my hands aren't moving much, that might tell you that I'm not as engaged in that as I am in other topics. But all in total, our nonverbal communication provides supplementary information to what we're expressing verbally. Okay, so it's very important that we're aware of this because people are going to interpret those communications. We also have to be aware of the physical distance between us and others when we're communicating. Okay, and often physical distance can be influenced by cultural norms. There can be a variety of factors that influence the physical distance that people are aware of. All right, one of the things that I would recommend to you is that you take signals from other people when you're communicating. I've been in conversations before in different events where people have kind of stepped into my personal space to the point that I'm not comfortable with it, and I take a step back and then they take another step forward. And then before I know what's going on, we're on the other side of the room and it looks almost like we're dancing together. Okay? So you want to be aware that if you keep stepping forward towards somebody and they keep backing away, that maybe they feel like you're invading their personal space. Conversely, as the person who's backing away, I need to think about what message am I sending if I keep backing away? Am I telling this person just that they're invading my personal space? Am I telling them that I'm not interested in what they're saying? We want to be aware of what we are communicating by physical distancing. And channel richness deals with the amount of information that is communicated by different forms of communication. Okay, so as you look at this chart here, this chart shows us where many of the things that we've talked about in this lesson rate in terms of those that are lowest on channel richness and those that are highest on channel richness. So when we look at things that are pretty low on channel richness, we'll see formal reports, bulletins, memos, letters, pre-recorded speeches, email, things like that. Okay, those that are highest on channel richness are video conferences, face-to-face conversations, telephone conversations, and even live speeches. Now, what you'll notice here is you can look at this and say, well, great, why don't we always have face-to-face conversations or do video conferences? Because those are the most rich forms of communication. Well, the answer to that is they're also the most costly. Okay, it's a lot easier and more efficient to send out a formal bulletin or a report or a memo than it is to call a video conference or meet with people face to face. So we often need to evaluate what is the information we need to communicate, how do we need to communicate it, and how much richness do we need as we determine what type of communication is most appropriate. Building on this idea of channel richness, let's talk about how we decide between oral communication and written communication. One of the factors that we're going to consider is whether or not a message is routine. All right. So for short, easy, routine messages, written communication can be appropriate. Okay. We also will tend to look at what type of feedback we need to get from people when we're communicating. All right. So if we do need to understand how receptive people are to our communication, then oral communication is beneficial. All right. So, for example, if you've ever been in one of my classes, there are times that I need to make a change to something in the syllabus. And I might not be fully sure what it is that I want to do as far as how I make the change, because I might want to do it in a way that I think is in my students' best interest, but I might also recognize that they need to tell me what's in their best interest. So I'll open up a dialogue and we might just talk for 5 minutes in the beginning of class so that I can get their perception on the situation and then make a decision based upon that. All right. Written communication, however, this is where we need to do things that in a way that are a little more reliable. We might have complex or more lengthy communications. So I send emails to my students every week. Those emails tend to have a lot of information in them. All right. And it's stuff that I put in an email so the students have a record of it. Okay. So nothing gets missed there. That also helps create a record for me so I know exactly what it is that I communicated to my students. It's also important in communication that you know your audience, and in particular in written communication, make sure that you're using good grammar. All right. If you are sending people letters or sending emails or blogging and you have misspellings and grammatical errors, you're sending a lot more information than you might be intending to. Okay. You're communicating information about your conscientiousness and the work that you do. You also may be perceived as communicating information about your intelligence. So you want to make sure that you're using tools that are available to you. If you're using Microsoft Word, make sure you hit the spell check button and that you catch all the easy errors. Okay, make sure you proofread your work. If you can have somebody else proofread it, have them proofread it. Okay, you also want to consider what expectations are in terms of social media. Some industries or in some companies, even there are expectations as to how people are going to portray themselves on Twitter and on LinkedIn. You want to make sure that you are following those expectations, unless you're intentionally not following them. Okay, you also want to remember that how you engage in written communication and when you engage in written communication is something that people notice. All right. So if you're sending text messages or emails during meetings, that may not be well received. And if you send your boss an email in the middle of a meeting that you're in with your boss, they may look at the timestamp and start to wonder whether or not you were paying attention in the meeting. So you want to be careful about all these types of things in your communication, because each one of these things we just discussed is communicating more information than the message you've intended. Another important component to communication is information security. So, communication is all about collecting information and what do we do with that information after we have it. Now, in some cases, like if you have information on health matters or educational matters, you may have legal requirements in terms of how you have to protect that information. In other cases, you may have just ethical requirements in terms of how you have to protect that information. But it's important to understand what the requirements are and make sure that you are abiding by them. It's also important to know that companies may have access to monitoring internet use, email records, and things of that nature. So if you are communicating on a device that is owned by your company or on your company's network, you should be aware that whatever you're communicating is something that your company may have access to. How we interpret information can be impacted by how we process information. Okay, so in human information processing, there's two things: one called automatic processing, and the other called controlled processing, that we engage in. Okay, now we can only engage in controlled processing basically on one task at a time. So we kind of toggle back and forth between automatic and controlled. And with automatic processing, what we're really doing is we're responding to stimuli in our environment in such a way that we don't have to pay detailed attention to them. Whereas with controlled processing, we're paying a little more attention and we're a little more analytical in what we're doing. Okay, so if you give somebody data and you give them graphs and you give them detailed information, they're more likely to engage in controlled processing than when you're using other types of communication methods. Okay, one of the things, like I said, is that people toggle back and forth between controlled processing and automatic processing. So if the information that you give them is something that they don't think they need to pay attention to, they may engage in more automatic processing and not quite receive all the information that you're trying to communicate. Now, whether or not we engage in automatic or controlled processing can be influenced by factors such as whether or not we're interested in what we're hearing, our prior knowledge on a topic. Sometimes our personality influences it, or other message characteristics can influence this as well. So, if you're trying to be an effective communicator, one of the things that you want to do is you want to know your audience and figure out how do you tailor that message to their interests. How do you tailor it so it's aligned with their prior knowledge in such a way that you're going to be more likely to get them to engage in controlled processing and pay attention to the message that you're trying to communicate so that they receive all the information that you're sending. Earlier in the lesson, we talked about noise in the communication model. So we're going to kind of get into some noise here and talk about barriers to effective communication. And the first barrier we're going to talk about is selective perception. And with selective perception, people essentially pick up certain pieces of information that they feel are relevant or that they choose to recognize, and they may just completely ignore other pieces of information. Now, another barrier to effective communication is language. And language is not always about if somebody speaks English or French or Spanish or Portuguese, but it can be just about how we use different terms within our culture, what we expect terms to mean. Okay, so the example that I have here is when I was growing up, I only ever heard the term body count used in reference to fatalities. Okay, so there's an example from a news article here. It says Mayor Gonzalez admitted that it was unreal to expect an immediate end to Tijuana's murder crisis, but hoped the body count could be reduced and insisted the city's economy remained unaffected. Okay, so as you could see from reading that sentence, body count basically is related to fatalities or the number of bodies that belong to people who are now dead. Okay, so you can imagine my surprise when my daughter came home from school and was talking to me about something that was going on in high school, and she mentioned a student with a body count of 8 in her high school. And to me, I only knew about a body count being something that was associated with fatalities, and I was kind of shocked as I heard this. But apparently, this is a slang term that the students are using these days in the high school, and it means something completely different from what I thought. Okay, so naturally, in our communication, we had kind of a block in terms of what she meant, because she was sending one message, but I received another one based upon my knowledge of the language. In addition to selective perception and language, we can also have barriers to communication that come in the forms of things like information overload, or when you have so much information coming at you that you don't receive certain amounts of it. Okay, I do some research in the warnings area, and one of the things that we find is that sometimes people don't pay attention to warnings because they're so used to seeing warnings that they start to tune them out when they see them, because they get so much information about product safety warnings that they start to discard information as it comes through, or not even recognize it. Okay, our emotions can get in the way of our communication. So sometimes if we're highly emotional, if we're maybe if we're very very mad or very very angry, or even very sad, we might not notice certain information that's being communicated to us. And then also silence can get in the way. So it's easy to ignore silence or lack of communication because it's defined as a lack of information. But this can be a real problem to our communication when people don't contribute, when they don't provide feedback. All right, and also lying can be very detrimental to communication. Okay, lying is obviously going to be detrimental to communication because it involves people giving incorrect information. And that's everything for this video on communication. I hope this video helped you to see how important communication can be to organizational behavior. All right, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you soon.